All right, welcome everybody. I'm Keith Siska from Last Call Bar Academy, and we're here with a couple students, non-trads. And so we're going to talk about my advice for non-traditional applicants. How do we define non-traditional applicant? Is it just older, work experience? I guess just not K to JD, right? I mean, traditional, I think, would also include students with just a gap year or a couple years off. So non-traditional would mean this is a second career, or you've got a graduate degree or some kind of unusual thing in your resume. And so Kurt, you certainly do. You've graduated a while back and you're running a business. Ashton, you might be interested to know, is a chemist, and she's also making a career change, and she's a non-traditional student. Remind me, Carmen, how do you fit in the non-trad category? You're pretty young.
Um, I'm not that young, but thank you. No, I've been working in fashion since I graduated college.
What
So I've
kind of
been at
work?
school for like 5 years. In photography, but mostly in fashion.
I
So
see. Yeah, that's
yeah, I've
interesting.
been out of school for like five years, something like that.
And so Carmen's really modest. She got her score right in the middle of my session yesterday and didn't say anything, but she smoked the LSAT on her last attempt. And so she's a good person
Thanks.
to talk to for advice. Her path wasn't linear. She didn't just come out swinging and ace it and then move on. And she's been frustrated at certain points. And so if you feeling overwhelmed or frustrated, you may consider chatting with her about that.
I'm always
The
happy to talk to anybody, by the way.
That's what I figured. That's why I offer. You're very social. So I want to talk about decision fatigue. And the reason I started reading about this concept is that I had several paralegals as students when I branched out as an independent tutor. And I remember starting those engagements with a lot of enthusiasm, thinking they're bright people, they're professionals, they're highly driven, they know what they're getting into, they do a lot of complex reading every day, and so it seemed like they were just primed to do well on the LSAT. And I consistently had trouble with that group of students. I never want to blame my students for the failures. I always try to look inward, and so I try to think about what am I not doing, or not how am I not motivating this group of people as a group. What do they have in common, and what can I do to serve them better? And I started learning about this concept called decision fatigue. And I happen to know that paralegals work very hard. They work a lot of hours. They're really the backbone of many law firms. And when there's extra work, they're expected to stay, and their study schedules are expected to conform to their work schedules. And so, really, work is the priority for a paralegal, and LSAT prep is secondary. And I always felt like part of the problem with that group of students was that they were just spent. They were working 10 hours, coming home, and then their study hours were the leftover hours. So I started investigating this psychological principle called decision fatigue, and it refers to the phenomenon that describes the deteriorating quality of decisions that you make. In other words, the more and more important decisions that you make in a short period of time, the less bandwidth you have to make more important decisions. It's just, like any other kind of fatigue, physical fatigue, the more of it you do, the less of it you can continue to do. And what's really interesting to me about this is that decision fatigue, it's a particular problem in the context where you are making trade-offs, and it causes you to make irrational trade-offs. So what do we mean by a trade-off? This is a sort of an asymmetrical comparison where you have two things and you have to choose. Each of them has different positive and negative elements, and then you have to somehow balance them. And it's complicated because it's not a one-to-one analysis. That reminds me a lot of the LSAT decisions. What am I supposed to do right now? Should I read this book over that one? Um, what are the merits of this answer choice versus that answer choice? So I think LSAT prep is all about making logical, high quality trade off decisions at every step. And if you're fatigued from your work or fatigued from studying, your ability to make high quality trade off decisions will necessarily suffer. Um, One of the things that I found really interesting in my prep for today's discussion is that there are some philosophers or psychologists rather who think that this decision fatigue phenomenon can even explain sort of chronic poverty. And I found that to be really interesting because the example that they gave was that someone who lives in poverty would have a lot of difficult decisions to make going to the grocery store, which is, a routine, necessary experience that we all encounter. And I remember this sort of it's sort of a concrete experience for me. 15, 20 years ago when I was younger in my career and raising a child, I remember having to make those trade-offs at the grocery store, and doing things like paying bills and making financial decisions was extremely stressful. And now that I'm further along in my career and my children are grown and my financial situation is different, paying bills is kind of fun for me now. Right. And that illustrates the kind of difference that the stressful decisions that you have to make, the kind how that kind of stress can cascade into other areas of your life. So I thought that was a really interesting dynamic that was discussed on the Wikipedia page, and I intend to do a little more thinking and researching into that. But one of the things that decision fatigue can lead to is an avoidance of decisions altogether, decision avoidance. And I think there may be two incarnations of this in LSAT prep. You may choose not to study because of fatigue. It might even be literal physical exhaustion, and you just say, I have to go to bed. I can't study tonight. But also, I think decision avoidance occurs within your studies, within an exam. For example, if you like an answer choice early in a sequence of five, I find that most students shift to a mindset of decision avoidance where they actually aren't interpreting or analyzing the remaining answer choices carefully, because doing so would force them to have to go back and reconsider the early choice that they liked. It's psychologically easier if they avoid that decision by just skimming past the remaining answer choices and using the confirmation bias to say, I've already found the answer. So this one must be wrong. This one must be wrong. This one must be wrong. I think that's an instance of decision avoidance, essentially. So a couple more points about decision fatigue. The essence of this is that the process of choosing can drain your resources, leaving you less capable of carrying out complex activities. That impairs self-regulation. It impairs your ability to make high-quality decisions, impairs your ability to study and learn. One of the analogies that I give, I used to have to drive on I-35 to work, which is like one of the worst highways I can imagine. It's super high speed limits, very high congestion, very large vehicles, semi trucks and large trucks. And so by the time I even used to arrive at work, I had already made life changing decisions. How can I look at an LSAT question after doing that and give it full intellectual effort? Even if I try to, there's a psychological principle operating in the background where your brain knows that decision isn't as important as the 100 that I, would make driving to work. Okay, so that's my spiel about decision fatigue. Does anyone want to jump in, or shall we talk a little bit about analysis paralysis? Analysis paralysis, I wanted to discuss it because I think that this is a problem that occurs more often for students who invest too heavily in the strategy guides and don't incorporate enough time testing early in their studies. It's why my triple review method has time testing as step number one, so that it's always front and center, that the goal is to bring the lesson back home to how it's going to apply to the time test. So after you've read a tome like the PowerScore Bibles, it can be tempting to try to analyze every aspect of every question, every game, every scenario. And then students almost feel like if they can't make the perfect diagram or the perfect prephrase or the perfect resolution to whatever issue is at hand, then they can't move forward or progress to answer the question. They become paralyzed. Happens in the answer choices frequently. And I think that also goes back to the decision fatigue and to those cost benefit type of decisions that you have to make. But some of the reasons for analysis paralysis are both internal to the exam. This can also explain people's reluctance to study. It can explain procrastination in people's studies. So, for example, something that appears overly complicated can prevent people from making decisions. If there are so many LSAT resources on the market that you can't properly evaluate them all, some people respond to that by making no decision at all and saying, well, I'm not going to have any resource. They're afraid that they'll buy the wrong one. I suppose other people go the opposite way and do too little research and not enough due diligence before committing to a resource. But another person may desire a solution, but fear that making a decision could result in error while on the way to a better solution. This is sort of the perfection is the enemy of the good. There's a better solution, and if I just keep working, I'll find it. And that fails to appreciate the concept of diminishing returns, which is particularly important on the LSAT. The LSAT's a time test, and one of the things that frustrates me is sometimes I'll work with a student and show them demonstrably, you took 7 minutes to get that question wrong. On average, you're working a question in 2.5 minutes. It was a total mistake to attempt the question. Even if you had gotten it right, that would have been an error. And even with that kind of illustration, our minds play this kind of trick on us where people think, yeah, but I have to do the questions in order, or, this is just the way I have to do it. It's hard for people to factor in the time component and realize that every question isn't equivalent to every other question, and that you have to make decisions in an uncertain environment. I like to describe this as becoming comfortable with discomfort. You can't be certain about the decisions you make on the LSAT. At some point, you have to be sure enough. This is better than that, not this is definitively correct or perfect. The opposite end of the spectrum is this extinct by instinct phenomenon, which simply means that some people refuse to engage in any deep analytical work at all and rely exclusively on intuition for their solutions to complex problems. That, I find, is typical of students who've taken the opposite approach. They've done nothing but practice tests and haven't dived into the strategies at all. And so, of course, what else can they do? They don't know enough theory to unpack the games or the arguments or the reading comp passages in a more disciplined way. And so the only thing they really can do is use instinct to answer the questions. What's really difficult is when a student has strong reading skills and gets good scores with that method. It's hard for me to break them of it and to convince them that they have to abandon the comfort of intuition and start to try new models of reading and thinking, or else they'll never be able to push the boundaries on their current abilities. All right, second slide about analysis paralysis, just to summarize. It's a fear of making an error or foregoing a superior solution. And the key is that can outweigh realistic expectations about potential value. That affects people's decision-making processes, and in some cases leads to them being unable to make a decision. Time-trapped questions where they're stuck between a few answer choices and waffle back and forth and can't come to a resolution. I used to say that time traps were the biggest source of difficulty on reading comprehension. That was my opinion, that the section was, for the most part, pretty easy, and that the hard questions were sort of anomalies, and that's what made the section so difficult, that you could approach many of the questions in sort of a superficial way. How could you then come up with a strategy that would correctly predict when you needed to probe deeper, and how could you develop the skills to do so? So that's sort of, relevant to this topic at hand. The fourth bullet point here, the analysis paralysis becomes the biggest problem in critical decisions where the decision has to be reached quickly. And what's interesting is that sometimes what people don't realize is that delaying the decision is worse than making a bad decision. I have a a partner that I work with on my podcast. It's called LSAT Life, by the way, if you guys want to search for it. But John Richardson, he likes to say that if you're going to get a question wrong, at least do it quickly. And so I find that to be humorous, because it could be that a quick wrong answer is actually more valuable than a very prolonged correct answer, depending on the exact time frames that we're talking about here. Okay, one final topic, unless anybody wants to jump in. Early in my career, I started to learn that mental multitasking, the research is clear that it's very bad for your mental performance of the individual tasks. And what I think is fascinating about it is that we don't seem to perceive this directly. We seem to believe that we can continue to accomplish the underlying task with the same level of proficiency, even while we're engaging in multiple tasks. But if it's not perfectly clear that mental multitasking is hard or impossible, I mean, there's simple things that convince me of that it's true. Sometimes my wife will try to tell me something, an appointment next week, while I'm replying to an email or doing some work. Uniformly, I'll forget it, and then we'll have an argument about it the following week. So it's clear to me that when she's talking to me and telling me important information, I have to shut down the distractions, stop mental multitasking, and focus on what she's telling me. Sometimes more than focus on it, I have to write it down. I have to use some kind of heuristic to make it more concrete for myself. So I think that's a really palpable example of why mental multitasking is bad. Even for simple tasks, it's bad. For complex tasks like interpreting English sentences and logic, it's particularly bad. I mean, the point is that your brain cannot fully focus when you're multitasking. And what's interesting is you think that the multitasking is saving you time, but actually the studies show that people take longer to complete the tasks than they would have if they had just done them sequentially, and they are more prone to make errors. So what I'm talking about here is that when you're developing your LSAT strategy, your in-test time strategy, to the greatest degree possible, you should stop multitasking. Make it one small task at a time, one small step at a time. Instead of let me find all the deductions, have a step-by-step plan for finding deductions. Instead of predicting the answer, step-by-step plan for unpacking the argument, organizing it, understanding the nature of the question, and then predicting the answer, a series of steps that gets you there. And if you execute the steps sequentially, you're more likely to accomplish each one accurately. And what I found is that by breaking it apart into steps like that, ultimately, I end up becoming quicker at the end of the process because I stop relying on my intuition, which is going to be multitasking. Intuition is going to be jumping from solution to solution until it lands on the right one. And the reason this doesn't work, or the reason why it slows you down, what the studies show is that the jump from one topic to another, from one solution to another, that takes a little bit of time to make that transition, and you lose it. There's no problem solving going on during that period of time. So you want to make the mental shifts as few as possible, which means you have to complete each task before you move on to the next one. You don't necessarily have to use my system or PowerScore system, but you should have a mental checklist for virtually every scenario on the LSAT. And it's one that you're continuing to develop and refine as you study the test and become better at time testing. But the bottom line is that mental multitasking harms your efficiency and costs you time. It's a double whammy. So figure out, what are the essential things that I need to do for each task that the test asks me to perform? What are the steps for each task? And then go about executing those set of steps over and over and over again until they become routine. It's about learning the pattern of steps, when to execute what, so that you're not bouncing back and forth and using an inefficient process. Now, what was interesting to me is that there is some research that suggests that you can train your brain to multitask. But the interesting caveat of that research is that there was a limit to how good you could become at it. And the limit was the speed at which the prefrontal cortex could process the incoming information. So, what seemed to be happening is that people aren't actually getting better at doing multiple things. What they're getting better at doing is each individual task. And then that is creating a quicker process overall. And that's what I'm advocating for LSAT prep. Break everything down into a series of steps and then become highly skilled at each individual step. The end process is seamless at that point. You're just executing the steps that you already know how to execute. So the bottom line of the research is that although people could get better at multitasking by practicing, what they found is that they're doing it by becoming more proficient at each underlying task and therefore completing more of it and having to switch between tasks less frequently. The bottom line of the studies is essentially that your brain seems to be really incapable or at least extremely limited when it comes to actual multitasking. And when you seem to be multitasking, you're really just becoming more proficient at the underlying tasks and accomplishing them quicker so that you can do more tasks in a shorter period of time. So I thought that that was all really fascinating stuff. And, um, there's another phenomenon at play that I talk about here on my last slide, chunking. Chunking has to do with taking pieces of information and kind of summarizing them or symbolizing them in one chunk. And, 5 bits of information become represented by one. That, I think, is also one of the things that occurs when you study the content of the LSAT. The words like necessary and sufficient have very deep logical meanings. And at some point, you can invoke the depth of that entire concept with just one word, one bit of your short term memory. So, studying for the LSAT is a really strange mix between developing skills in improvisation, but also developing core long term memories that can be called upon in order to chunk the logic or the content or the information that they're providing for you. Such a complicated test. I mean, all of this really underscores why it takes people 6 months, 12 months, 18 months to prep for the LSAT. And the people who do it in 3 months, I don't accuse them of dishonesty. What I say is that that's the exception. It's certainly not the norm, not in my experience as a tutor. And I understand that the group of people I work with is a self selecting sample as a tutor. But even among the other tutors that I know, um, many of them took many months, especially when they got to the high reaches of the 160s and into the 170s. Many of them took a long time from there to kind of perfect the process. All right, well, that's all I've got as far as a presentation today. So if you guys want to ask any questions, Ashton says that she likes the triple review method. Thank you, Ashton. I spent literally 20 years developing triple review, and one of the early inspirations for it was a conversation that I had on the Top Law Schools forum many years ago. The toplawschools.com used to be the go-to resource for law school applicants. I think that designation is probably Reddit now, but at any rate, at one time, Top Law Schools was really the place where the tutors and the legal professionals hung out, or the legal education professionals. And people started talking about this study method where you would take a time test, you don't look up your answers, and then you retake the test or the section, depending on how you break it down, with no time limit. And as an educator, this appealed to me greatly because I know from the research of education psychology that people tend to learn much better when they're in a problem solving mode as opposed to a memorization or reverse engineering mode. If you show them the solution and tell them memorize this process, that's boring to their brain. if they can't figure out how to get to the solution, that's kind of intriguing. Now, some people will give up. It's the analysis paralysis. It's too hard. But to a real curious intellectual, the inability to find the answer is what drives the brain to keep thinking critically about the problem. And so that process really appealed to me. And I started teaching it to some students. Then Seven Sage came along and they gave it a name, and they get all the credit because they gave it a brilliant name. They called it Blind Review, and that gave it credibility. A big company was behind it. There was a term that you could use to say, this is what I'm talking about. It's just not some crazy thing in the back of my mind. And ever since they gave it some legitimacy, I've had more success getting students to buy in. And that actually convinced me that a third round of review could be beneficial. Once you've pushed your own limits to find the answers, once you've reached your own limit, I should say, then you look up the answer and allow the resources, the tutors, and the rest of the community to finish the job. All right, so Kurt, I have a link that I'll share with you, some infographics with information about triple review. I'll put that in the chat here. And if people are watching on YouTube, I'll try to remember to drop some links in the comments, or you can go to my Facebook page and Last Call Bar Academy and search for the logical reasoning. Well, it's under all the materials. I have an infographic on triple review for each of the 3 sections, explains what to do for each of the 3 stages of study. I developed this because my tutoring rate became too high, and I'm a bleeding heart. And so I wanted my students to be able to self-prep. I felt like, I feel like I'm worth the rate, but I also feel like I'm only worth it if they've done enough independent work so that they've already reached the limits of their own capability. And then I can push them a little further. But when I'm teaching students elementary things that I think they could either figure out on their own or could learn from a less expensive resource, that it doesn't feel great to me. And so over the years, I just developed this system, and I was afraid, honestly, that I would just talk myself right out of a job. I kept it very proprietary for 2-3 years. I would charge people a few $100, so, to an hour to just teach them the system. And when I left bar prep, I decided that I would take Seven Sage's approach and just give it away and say, this is the marquee thing that I teach. And if everybody learns about it, I think that will buy me some credibility and more people will want to work with me. So that's the direction I went. And those 3 cards represent the culmination of many years of thought and research on that subject. All right, I'm talking too much. Anyone want to jump in with a question?
I actually have a question.
Yeah, go ahead, Carmen.
Um, I've been with you guys for a while, but I feel like I haven't found the best way that the third part of triple review, because I'm a blind review diehard, right? Like I practice with my extra time, but it's still good, I think, for me to go through like questions, just really go through them. But I feel like I haven't found the way of doing the third step of that like I can look at a question for a third time around and it won't just feel like white noise or like I remember it too much.
Mm-hmm.
Because I remember them, like I really do. I remember my pattern of thinking. So it's like the third time around just feels like kind of the first 2. And I feel like that might be what I'm missing to like get through my like small plateau that I'm trying to break through.
You're touching on an interesting thing, which is that the third step is trying to do too much. And I'm not sure how to reconcile this tension because 4 steps isn't quite as elegant as 3. So here's what I mean by that. When you're done with blind review, there are 2 things left to do. And I've crammed them all into 1 step and just called it strategy planning. But one thing you have to do is you have to look at the questions that you got wrong on blind review. It would be nice if I could always correct my timed errors on blind review and get a perfect score on the untimed portion. But that's not true. There are legitimately some questions, even untimed, they stump me. They trick me. I fall for something. I misinterpret it, whatever the problem is. So the first step of strategy planning isn't really about the strategy. It's about the conceptual development that you need to make sense of the questions that you couldn't answer. The ones that you got wrong on blind review, you still need a little more knowledge to get those right, a deeper framework, a different perspective, something. Maybe nothing more than an explanation from velocity prep, or maybe it's a small step, but you need one more step to get the gist of why the right answer is right, why the wrong answer is wrong. And that's where I think that exercise that I developed, where you convert your wrong answer into a right one, I think that's what that is really intended to do, to see, did you understand the explanation? Did you truly understand what you did wrong? And do you have the verbal dexterity to then recreate that wrong answer in the same spirit, but fix where it went wrong? That's a really hard exercise. And it's so hard that it probably feeds into that analysis paralysis. It's impossible for some people to fix the answers. I know that. I work with students. They don't always get it right. I have to tell them how to fix their wrong answers in many instances. So that's one thing. The second thing that strategy planning is attempting to do is completely different. And I maybe I'll talk to Jake about breaking this into two different steps. But the second part of strategy planning is literally about planning a strategy for the next test. And that's about thinking about, which questions did I get wrong? Why did I miss them? What were the strategic errors that I made in that section? And what are the cues that I'm going to use in the future to take me in a different course? The way that I like to ask the question is, what do I wish I had done the first time around? It's so contrived. You think, how can I get better at a test? By asking, it's kind of like shoulda, woulda, coulda. Like, how can I get better at a test? By asking what I should have done in the past. But honestly, that's how I come up with concrete strategies for the next test. I think about, legitimately, if I could go back in time and tap myself on the shoulder before I started that test and said, hey, dummy, try this right now, what would it be? I can't tell you the answer. I can only tell you the strategy. What would it be? And then whatever it is, I do that. I mean, the next time test, that's the only thing that I do. So, for example, I'll give you an example. I missed a question recently on Prep Test 80. It asked what two people agree about. And for the last 100 iterations of that question, it's asked what they disagree about. So I picked an answer choice that represented a point of disagreement, because I'd forgotten that one phrase in the question. And so on my next time test, what I decided was that I was going to be far more deliberate about reading and interpreting questions, and highlighting relevant words in the question that I wanted to make sure I didn't lose sight of before I chose a final answer. The other thing that I did in my strategy is, I would for that one prep test alone, I before choosing my final answer on every question, I reread the question stem real quick to make sure I wasn't forgetting, the essence, going to make sure I hadn't done everything right and then just made a silly mistake at the end. So the next section, perfect score. And I don't think it's that one thing was the key. It's that when you are attentive to what you're doing, the metacognition, the self-awareness, it feeds into other avenues as well. I wasn't just more aware of the question stems, I was more aware of everything, because I had a plan to be more aware and a specific goal of what I needed to do to make that happen. So that's the kind of strategy plan that I'm talking about. The strategy plans that I come up with have two components: a trigger and an affirmative action. I don't want my strategy plan to be so vague that I won't remember to do it. Read more carefully. For 35 minutes? That's what I'm supposed to think about continuously for 35 minutes. Read carefully, read carefully, read carefully. Right? It's not a workable action plan. So, what I want to know is what's the trigger? At what point do I need to become aware I made a mistake last time? Let me choose a different path. And the trigger for me was when I'm reading the question stem. That was going to be my trigger. Or when I'm selecting the final answer. There were 2 points that I wanted to target to get to this problem. And then the affirmative action that I had in mind was slow down and be more deliberate on the read because they are becoming more crafty with the way that they word the questions. And I think that's true overall, not just that one question. They're asking the same kinds of questions, but boy, do they vary the language in ways that can be tricky if you're reading too quickly. So my first step was when I get to the question stem, slow down, read deliberately, affirmative action plan. It wasn't don't make a mistake, dummy. Don't don't lose focus. It can't be negative. It has to be, well, what is the positive thing you want to do instead? Slow down, read carefully, and then the final trigger was as I'm selecting my final answer, skim the question stem one more time to make sure that I'm moving, that I'm confident that that does in fact answer the question. Now, you can't your action plans can't be additive. So then I will use that action plan until I miss another question or identify another big area of concern. And then for a week or two, my action plan will change and my focus will be different. I can't think about everything every time. I'm always going to go for the biggest source of error, whatever I've identified on the last test. But I think you're absolutely right, Carmen, that we tried to cram so much into strategy planning that part of it isn't about strategy planning, and that makes it hard to see why it's important to change those wrong answers to right ones. That's not about strategy. That's still about just understanding what you did wrong. It's after that that you can say, okay, well, now that I know that, I won't fall for that answer choice because what I will do is trigger strategy. When I see this, I'll do that. I write it down. I think that Jake came up with the idea of keeping, he hates the wrong answer journal. He thinks that's kind of silly. You're going to go back and like review your mistakes. Why? So you can do them again? What you need to be reviewing is the correct thing to do, reinforcing good techniques. So what he thinks you should keep a journal of are your action plans from section to section. And he thinks that actually would be useful to go back and review. And I think so too. If you could see how your strategies are evolving, then you can think about, all right, am I trending in the right direction? Am I forgetting some of the early learnings? The first few action plans, have I, 4 or 5 action plans in, am I starting to get lazy about those fundamentals? Should I go back and reincorporate those fundamentals as the new action plan for week 5 or week 6? Keeping track of how your action plan evolves for each section, that seems to me to be far more interesting and relevant to your studies than just here's a list of questions that I missed. So I'm with him on that one. I'd rather see my students do an action plan journal than a wrong answer journal. Part of the reason for that, though, is just because that would prove they completed the process. And triple review is so dense. It almost like can't fail. This is why Jake and I have such confidence and why I had no doubt you were going to get a good score, Carmen, because you were sticking with triple review and you were hitting setbacks, but keeping with it and keeping with it. And if we can just get students to be patient and stick with the process and keep doing it, eventually they get really strong and they hit a home run. And then they're like, whoa, I didn't know I could do that. So I think you did a great job. And I think that it's a win for the method that we put in place, that it keeps you going when you hit setbacks.
Thank you. Yeah, and I'm definitely like I live by triple review, and I think I could do more if my brain would allow it. But sometimes I only have so much time that I can sit down and like focus. And also I only have so many times that I can see a single question and not be like haunted by it forever. So I feel like I'm just trying to figure out what I'm missing to close that gap, because it's like, I mean, I only need to consistently hit a couple more points. Like it's not that much at this point, but like there's definitely something in there that I feel like I could be doing more of. And it's probably that third part. I haven't done that enough.
Well, I'm going to be doing a class coming up without Jake. He may join, I don't know, but what I think has happened is that he's in Atlanta for a month, and so I think he's kind of overwhelmed with work and the change of routine. And I pitched to him doing some kind of experimental project, because we've got the license with LSAC now, and he expressed some concern about the model that I had in mind. So I thought, well, maybe I'll give it a shot on my own so that the stakes are a little lower. And if it works, I'll bring him on board. And if it doesn't, we'll ditch it. But I think the week after next, I'm going to do a 4-hour class over 2 weeks, like we have in the past. And I'll pick a prep test. You can pick it if you want to take the class. I don't care which prep test we do, something between 71 and 89. And I'm just going to try to teach it in 4 sections the way that we have. The only difference will be it will probably be without Jake until he's back in New York and has a little more time for that.
Yeah, I mean, I'm always game. That sounds really good.
Okay, I will get it on the calendar and share that with you guys, and you can. I'm going to make each session individually available. I'm going to try to make it a little more flexible. So if like you're only interested in a logic game section from one test, you can do that. Or if you're only interested in LR or RC, that's fine too. And then there'll be kind of a discount for buying all 4 of the classes together. That's how I'm gonna structure it.
Cool, that sounds awesome. Thank you, Keith.
Sure, it's gonna be fun. I'm
They
disappointed
always
that
are.
Jake's busy, but he has some business outside of LSAT, and so I have to kind of keep some boundaries. You have any questions for me, Kurt? You've been quiet.
Yeah, I've just been taking in what you guys are saying. And I think I'm kind of new to this, so I don't have the depth of knowledge that you guys have, obviously. But I did notice something that I do wrong is I am pretty worldly. I know a lot of things, so I have problems with my own assumptions. So sometimes I'll make an assumption and I've made that assumption, but it's not an assumption that you can make because now you get the wrong answer.
Here's what I'll say about that. The LSAC, if you look at the instructions for LR, it says that you should not make assumptions that are by common sense standards implausible, superfluous, or inconsistent with the passage. I've read it many times because I think it's a fascinating part of the directions. You should not make assumptions that are by common sense standards implausible, superfluous, or inconsistent with the passage. So that raises the question then, what do we mean by common sense standards?
Yeah.
Right? What is a fair assumption to make? What is not a fair assumption to make? That becomes where the rubber really meets the road. And here's how I answer that question. I think it's a brilliant test because of this exact point. The way that you answer that question is the exact same way that you would answer an uncertain legal question. And so here's what I mean. You get a LR question, and you can analogize that to an appellate case where the court has a question before it. Is this an instance of negligence or not? And the attorneys brief different answers to the court. They say, I think it is because of this. And the other attorney says, I don't think it is because of these reasons. And so there's, 4 or 5 different theories that the appellate court contemplates. And then at the end of the day, the court chooses the theory that it likes best. And it says, this is the correct rule of law for this case. And then what you have to do to understand the law on that issue is you have to then incorporate the holding of that case into your schema of the law in that field. Right. So which assumptions are plausible and acceptable? It's the ones that lead to the correct answers. And if you make an assumption that leads to a wrong answer, it's not that your idea of what is common sense is wrong. It's that you have to then align your expectations for the LSAT. They draw the line here, and now you start to adjust how you interpret the test.
Yeah,
And so, yeah, if you just do that over and over and over again, it reminds me of law school. You read case after case, each one amends the rules a little bit, and there's cases you agree with, and there's cases you agree with, and there's cases you predict correctly, and there's ones you don't predict correctly, but you don't get to make the rules. It's always your job to incorporate the knowledge from that new case into your concept of the rules. And that's how I teach my students to do the LSAT, one question at a time, using the process that works until that process doesn't work. And then you figure out why, you modify it, and you go forward. And that's the strategy planning step that Carmen was asking about.
That makes sense.
It's not.
And I will say, oh, sorry, Keith.
No, go ahead. Go ahead.
No, I was just gonna say, like, I will say that I think towards the beginning of me really getting into it, and like I have some specific considerations when it comes to RC in terms of English is not my first language, so the language can really get me. But I do remember, like, every time I hit like an art passage, which is like I went to art school, so that's what I know. I would be like, oh yeah, like this is my thing because I know things about it. And then I would just end up getting so many more questions wrong than I thought, because like I love thinking and I would just completely incorporate things that were not, like I took it a little bit too far, but then I'd hit passages where like I don't think I could tell you what it was about if I tried, and like I would end up getting them right because I was only going by what they told me, and somehow it was easier to identify without like all the other outside knowledge that you're pulling in from things. So there's definitely a balance in there, though, I think.
You struck a nerve because, I've been to law school. If I miss a question on a law RC passage, it stings bad. And I find those passages to be devilish. I think they're very difficult. So it's not all that uncommon for me to miss a question on a law passage. So I know where you're coming from. When you have knowledge in the field, you expect that to give you some leverage. And I think it does, but not in the way that we expect, which is why all of this practice testing is important. The way that it gives you an advantage is that your working knowledge of the vocabulary is more fluid. And so if you resist the temptation to go down all of the intellectual side roads that you're talking about, Carmen, you end up with this really firm summary of the piece because you have a very strong grasp of the vocabulary, the language that they're using. But when you allow yourself to indulge in the, that deeper introspection about your knowledge, that's when it becomes a trap. I don't like to tell people that your outside knowledge is a hindrance. I like to tell people that you have to learn how to use your outside knowledge to your advantage on the LSAT. And that's why working the questions one at a time, learning the rules of the game, misstepping. I mean, your failures are going to be the key moments of improvement. I love missing questions because I don't miss enough for LSAT prep to be truly engaging at this point. Without the students, it would be downright boring. So when I do miss a question, it gives me a large opportunity to really explore the deeper models and why that was such a challenging interpretational exercise for me. So that's the fun stuff for me, missing the questions. But you have to be in a legitimate growth mindset with curiosity about the content, I think, to get there. If your goal is just the score and just law school, LSAT prep can really be treacherous. I've got another 5 minutes, so anyone want to do a final question before we wrap up for the evening?
I have a lot of questions.
Yeah, go ahead.
I don't know. There's so many. I guess I would say. So you said like the LSAT trainer is a good start, and then once you finish that, then you want to move into something else like the online things like 7Sage or something like that.
Yeah, I
Um,
think go ahead if you want to ask something
yeah,
specific.
I mean, I don't have to get a super high score because I'm in Canada, and I think I need to be around a 157 or 160 to get accepted because I'm just going to stay at the local law school. It's not a big competition like it is in the US. So,
Hmm.
so as far as that would kind of be my goal. I am going to write in November, and then if I don't do well enough, then I'll write again in January.
Okay, good plan. You're giving yourself plenty of time.
Yeah, because I mean, I started about a month ago, and I'm already on 184 of the LSAT trainer, and I've got maybe 3 questions wrong so far out of all the questions that he had, and they were simple things like the one was a horoscope question where I assumed that a horoscope, how it works, would be a normal assumption to make, but it's not. And then I picked the one where it was about the geographical location as wrong, and I realized after, I'm like, well, the question or answer I picked doesn't make any sense. It has nothing to do with what they're asking. It just seems like it's okay, but it's not. So
I really appreciate students who want to do the self-learning because those moments of inspiration where you figure out what you did wrong and how to make the right connection on that question, those are tangible long-term memories that turn into skill development.
yeah,
Memorizing lists of indicator words, I mean, I don't think that ultimately lends itself to development of the skill.
well, I hate how I used to do things where I'd look at the answer and I'd do what you said, I'd reverse engineer the answer. But then I would see the exact same question because I didn't learn the process of how to actually get the right answer. I would still get the same question wrong. For example, in mathematics, if it's a problem question, I would still get that question wrong, just as I did before, because I actually didn't learn anything. I just learned how to do that exact specific question, that
Mhm.
exact specific way. So if there was one that had something slightly different, like let's say a 9 instead of an 8 or something, I'm like, I don't know how to do this.
To be a little more granular about advice for prep, I think that the trainer's a good resource to start with.
Yeah.
Then when you leave the trainer, I think that there's sort of a logical order to kind of think about mastering the sections. Logic games is the section that's kind of easiest to learn and requires the most repetition. So that's why I recommended Seven Sage. They have a good reputation for logic games. And after you finish the trainer, if you subscribe to their service for a month or two and consume the logic games materials first, I think that would give you a good foundation there. Now, logic games, the gist of logic games is that you have to make accurate deductions to solve the game. It teaches you how to engage in deductive logic. LR, I think, takes that skill and goes one step further, and it says, okay, well, if you know how to make deductions, now can you identify bad deductions and describe why they aren't warranted? That, I think, is an extension of the skills that you develop from logic games. So it doesn't make sense to me to really dive deep into LR until you're really good at logic games.
Right.
But that wasn't clear to me early in my career because I didn't realize that LR was based on deductive logic. I thought it was based on sort of persuasion, rhetoric. I didn't get that the rules of the game were the same as the logic game section.
Yeah.
All right, and then reading comp, I think, takes it to the next level. Let's say, okay, well, now that you can analyze one faulty, badly reasoned argument, can you take a series of arguments that are positioned together, in a rhetorical piece and analyze the strengths and weaknesses and implications of that? And ultimately, that's what is most like the work that you do in law school. And so I think that the learning the section should be logic games first, and Seven Sage has a strong reputation for that. But LSAT Demon has a stronger reputation for LR. So you might consider switching after a month or two from Seven Sage to Demon and checking out the LR resources.
Right.
Now, as far as reading comp, I like Manhattan Prep's book, but I don't think there's really an outstanding reading comp resource. Maybe because it depends so heavily on what and how you learned games and LR.
Right.
If you're not strong in those areas, I mean, the way that I teach people to analyze paragraphs on RC is to analogize them to stimuli on LR. So I'm totally explicit about it. Whatever you're doing on LR, do it here. And if you're doing the wrong thing on LR, then that means, you're doing the wrong thing on RC too under that approach.
Mhm.
So that's probably why it's so hard to teach RC. It's really the culmination of all the skills. And if you have this hodgepodge of skills,
Yeah.
no book can work with that.
Well, that'd be like a reverse pyramid. If you have poor foundation, it's very hard to build skills on top of that,
Right.
or a bad foundation.
And what's interesting is that a lot of people are intuitively good at reading comp, and
Mhm.
they don't realize that the real foundation is games and LR. And so it's hard for them to improve on reading comp. They don't see that as the path to improvement on RC. And I do. I see learning to think very concretely and literally, I think, is the teaching of logic games, and then being able to critique an inability to think or speak that way is the next step for LR. And when you've mastered those steps, if you can take your natural strong reading skills and add that layer to them, being able to think very literally and to critique arguments with that level of precision, it just gives you another lens for analyzing reading comp.
Yeah, well, I'll put it this way. I did have the Manhattan Prep book. I sent it back for now, but I did the first reading comp passage and I got all the questions right on time. So I think I was at 15 minutes, so too long, except for the main point. And I laughed at myself because I'm like, I got everything right, but I missed the point. So that's kind of funny to me.
I can get into some specific question types in a future lesson. So we've hit the end of the hour. I'm going to wrap it up. But what I want you guys to do is this. If you want more help from me, feel free to come to my weekly sessions. Tuesdays is for beginners. Wednesdays is for repeaters and high scorers. Thursdays is for non-trads. And if you reach out to me in advance and ask questions or tell me what topics you want to cover, I can be more more receptive to your needs. So
Perfect.
please feel free to reach out to me on Facebook or on my business page and let me know what you need me to speak about to help you move forward in your studies.
Thank you so much.
Sure, you're welcome. Thanks, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Oh, thank you, Keith.
You're welcome.